I watched my younger sister Freya get humiliated at a corporate networking event because of a tattoo on her wrist. But when Commander Thorne saw it, everything changed in ways none of us could have imagined. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. My name is Connor, and I've always been the protective older brother. At 32, I work in tech and make a decent living, but nothing compared to what my sister Freya has accomplished. She's 26 and absolutely brilliant at what she does. She climbed her way up to marketing executive at one of Seattle's most competitive firms, and she did it all while carrying burdens that would have broken most people. Freya has this quiet strength about her that I've always admired. She doesn't need to be the loudest person in the room to command respect, and she has this way of making everyone around her feel heard and valued. But there's also something she keeps guarded, something she's never fully shared with me despite how close we are. That something was connected to a small tattoo on her inner wrist. Just some numbers and symbols that she always claimed were personal whenever anyone asked. I never pushed because I figured when she was ready to tell me, she would. I had no idea that this tiny piece of ink would become the center of one of the most powerful moments I've ever witnessed. The event was supposed to be Freya's big break. She'd been invited to the Pacific Northwest Business Leadership Summit, one of those fancy networking events where careers are made and million-dollar deals happen over champagne and small talk. She'd been preparing for weeks, researching every attendee, practicing her elevator pitch in front of the mirror. Commander Thorne was there as the keynote speaker that evening. 45 years old, decorated Navy SEAL with more commendations than I could count, and the kind of presence that made everyone in the room stand a little straighter when he walked by. He was supposed to speak about leadership under pressure, about making decisions when lives depend on your judgment. None of us knew that these three people, my sister, myself, and this distinguished military officer, were about to be connected in a way that would change everything. None of us knew that a room full of successful business people was about to learn a lesson about respect, sacrifice, and the stories we carry with us. What started as networking event small talk was about to become something much more significant. Something that would teach all of us that we never really know the battles people have fought or the losses they've survived, and that sometimes the things we think make us different are actually the things that make us strongest. The tattoo on Freya's wrist was about to go from being a source of mockery to being a bridge between two worlds, a connection between sacrifice and strength that nobody in that room saw coming. The grand ballroom at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle was exactly the kind of place that intimidated most people. Crystal chandeliers hung from 20-foot ceilings, marble floors reflected the warm glow of elegant lighting, and servers in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. This was the annual Pacific Northwest Business Leadership Summit, where the region's most successful executives gathered to network, make deals, and show off their latest achievements. Freya stood beside me in the hotel lobby, smoothing down her black blazer for the third time in 5 minutes. She looked absolutely professional in her tailored suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect bun, but I could see the nervousness in the way she kept checking her reflection in every mirror we passed. "You look perfect." "Frey," I told her, adjusting my own tie. "Stop worrying. This isn't just another client meeting, Connor," she replied, her voice tight with anticipation. "The senior director position depends on tonight. I need to impress at least 3 of the board members, and 2 of them are notorious for being impossible to please." I understood why this mattered so much to her. After our parents died in that car accident when Freya was only 19, she had every excuse to give up, to let grief consume her future. Instead, she put herself through college while working 2 jobs, graduated summa cum laude, and fought her way up in one of the most competitive industries in Seattle. She'd been an account executive for 3 years, consistently bringing in the highest revenue numbers, but corporate politics meant she needed more than just results to advance. "Remember the Morrison account?" I said as we walked toward the ballroom entrance. "You turned a $30,000 budget into $120,000, and they loved you so much they signed a 3-year extension. Tonight's just a room full of people who need to see what I already know, that you're brilliant at what you do." She smiled at that, but I noticed something I'd seen countless times over the years. Without realizing it, Freya tugged at her left sleeve, making sure it covered the small tattoo on her inner wrist. It was such an automatic gesture that I wasn't even sure she knew she was doing it, but I'd witnessed it hundreds of times. Whenever she felt nervous, uncertain, or vulnerable, her hand would drift to that sleeve. The tattoo itself wasn't large or elaborate. From the few glimpses I'd caught over the years, it appeared to be just some numbers and maybe a few symbols, nothing that would normally draw attention. But Freya guarded it like it held state secrets. Whenever anyone asked about it, she'd give the same answer. It's just something personal. I'd stopped asking years ago, figuring she'd tell me when she was ready. As we entered the ballroom, I watched Freya transform. Her shoulders straightened, her smile became confident and warm, and she radiated the kind of professional charm that made clients trust her with million-dollar campaigns. This was her element, even if she was nervous. She knew how to work a room, how to make meaningful connections, and how to present ideas in ways that made executives reach for their checkbooks. "There's Bradley Crenshaw from Pacific Tech Solutions," she said, nodding toward a group near the bar. "He's the VP of Operations I told you about. If I can get him interested in our digital transformation package, it could be worth $2 million in revenue." I could hear the strategy in her voice, the careful planning that had gone into this evening. She'd researched every major player in the room, knew their company's challenges, and had specific talking points prepared for each conversation. This was Freya at her best, combining natural intelligence with meticulous preparation. But as we moved deeper into the room, I noticed something else. Despite her confidence and preparation, there was an invisible weight she carried, something that made her seem like she was always bracing for an impact that might never come. I'd seen it for years but never fully understood it. Tonight, I was about to learn exactly what that weight was and why a simple tattoo meant so much more than anyone could possibly imagine. The networking portion of the evening began at 7:30, and Freya wasted no time. She moved through the crowd with purpose, her research paying off as she approached her target group near the expansive windows overlooking Elliott Bay. Bradley Crenshaw stood at the center of a cluster of executives, holding court with his usual arrogant confidence. He was exactly what you'd expect from a tech VP. Expensive suit, perfectly styled gray hair, and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Crenshaw, I'm Freya Manning from Catalyst Marketing Group," she said, extending her hand with professional warmth. "I've been following Pacific Tech Solutions' expansion into the healthcare sector." "Impressive growth trajectory." Bradley shook her hand, his attention clearly divided between her and the other conversations happening around them. "Ah yes, Catalyst. You're the firm that handled the Morrison campaign. Not bad work." What followed was exactly the kind of conversation Freya excelled at. She spoke intelligently about digital transformation strategies, asked insightful questions about Pacific Tech's market challenges, and presented solutions that could genuinely impact their bottom line. I watched from a few feet away, proud of how she commanded respect through pure competence. Our analytics show that companies in your position typically see a 40% increase in qualified leads within the first quarter of implementation. Freya explained, gesturing with her hands as she spoke. That's when it happened. Her sleeve rode up just slightly, revealing maybe 2 inches of her inner wrist and the small tattoo she usually kept hidden. Bradley's eyes locked onto it immediately, and his entire demeanor shifted. The professional courtesy disappeared, replaced by something much uglier. "What's that scribble on your wrist?" he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for the surrounding conversations to pause. "Did you get drunk in college and tattoo your phone number?" The group turned their attention to Freya's wrist. Vivian Cross, the CEO of a major consulting firm, leaned in closer with obvious disdain. "It looks like random numbers and lines. Very unprofessional for someone trying to land corporate accounts." I felt my jaw clench from across the room. This was exactly the kind of corporate elitism that made my blood boil, but I knew Freya could handle herself. She'd dealt with worse. "It's just something personal," Freya replied, maintaining her professional tone while subtly tugging her sleeve back down. "As I was saying about your lead generation challenges, we've developed a framework that could address your current conversion issues." But Bradley wasn't done. "Personal? It looks like gibberish to me. Maybe you should invest in some concealer before the next executive meeting. Image matters in this business." The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable. Other executives in the group began chuckling, and I watched my accomplished, brilliant sister become the target of their entertainment. Robert Chen from Northwest Industries joined in. I have to agree with Bradley. Executive presence is everything. You can't expect to be taken seriously with amateur tattoos visible during business meetings. The conversation had completely derailed from business to personal attack. People from neighboring groups began turning their heads, drawn by the increasingly hostile tone. Several pulled out their phones, clearly preparing to capture whatever was happening for social media. This was turning into exactly the kind of public humiliation that could destroy a career in corporate Seattle. Freya's face had gone pale, but she held her ground. I understand not everyone appreciates personal expression, but I'm here to discuss how we can help your company increase market share. Perhaps we could focus on the solutions I've prepared. Solutions? Vivian laughed harshly. Maybe your first solution should be covering up your poor judgment. How do you expect us to trust your business decisions when you clearly make such questionable personal ones? The attacks were becoming more vicious, more personal. I started moving through the crowd toward the group, my protective instincts overriding everything else. But Freya caught my eye and gave me the slightest shake of her head. She wanted to handle this herself, even as these people tore her apart for something they couldn't possibly understand. That's when I noticed him. Across the room, Commander Thorne had stopped mid-conversation with a group of city officials. His attention was fixed entirely on our situation, and the expression on his face was one I couldn't quite read. Something between recognition and shock. The attacks continued to escalate, and I watched my sister's professional facade begin to crack under the relentless pressure. But instead of retreating or making excuses, Freya did something that reminded me why I'd always admired her strength. She straightened her shoulders, looked Bradley Crenshaw directly in the eyes, and spoke with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from surviving real hardship. I understand that not everyone appreciates personal expression in a corporate environment, she said, her voice steady despite the obvious pain behind her eyes. But I'm here tonight because I believe we can help Pacific Tech Solutions increase their market share by 40% in the next quarter. I've prepared a comprehensive analysis of your current challenges and developed specific solutions that could generate over $2 million in additional revenue. Shall we focus on that? The grace under pressure was remarkable, but Bradley seemed to take it as a challenge rather than an olive branch. His smile turned even more cruel, and he glanced around the circle to make sure he had his audience. Maybe you should focus on covering up your mistakes before giving business advice, he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the surrounding groups. I mean, really, what kind of judgment does it show when you permanently mark your body with random scribbles? How are we supposed to trust your strategic thinking? That's when Vivian Cross decided to escalate further. You know what? I think people should see this, she said, pulling out her phone. This is exactly the kind of unprofessionalism that gives marketing people a bad reputation. Someone needs to document this. Several other executives followed suit, phones appearing throughout the group. The humiliation was becoming a spectacle, and I could see other attendees throughout the ballroom turning to watch. This was turning into the kind of viral moment that destroys careers and follows people forever. Robert Chen from Northwest Industries joined the pile-on with obvious relish. I have to wonder what other poor decisions you've made that we can't see. Maybe we should all think twice before working with someone who shows such questionable judgment. The circle of attackers was growing. More executives had drifted over, drawn by the commotion and the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense. I could hear whispered comments and stifled laughter from the growing crowd. My sister was being turned into a cautionary tale, an example of why certain types of people didn't belong in their elite circles. But Freya refused to break. Even as phones recorded her humiliation, even as these successful, powerful people treated her like a curiosity to be mocked, she maintained her composure. There was something in her bearing that suggested she'd faced worse than this and survived. That's when I noticed the shift across the room. Commander Thorne had completely abandoned his conversation with the city officials and was staring directly at the situation with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. His expression wasn't just concerned or disapproving. It was something much more specific, like recognition mixed with disbelief. He excused himself from his group with a few quick words and began walking purposefully across the ballroom toward the commotion. There was something about the way he moved that commanded attention, a kind of military bearing that made people instinctively step out of his way. The crowd began to notice him approaching, and conversation started to die down. Bradley was still talking, still making jokes about amateur tattoos and poor judgment, but his voice was beginning to compete with the growing awareness that someone important was heading their direction. Vivian continued recording with her phone, but I could see her glancing nervously at the approaching figure. Commander Thorne moved through the crowd like a man on a mission. His dress uniform, decorated with more ribbons and commendations than I could count, made him impossible to ignore. People stepped aside, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The mocking voices gradually died down as this imposing figure drew closer. Even Bradley seemed to sense that the dynamic was about to change dramatically. The phones stayed up, but now they were capturing something different than they had expected. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when this decorated military officer reached the center of the controversy. I had no idea what was coming, but I could feel the energy in the room shifting from cruel entertainment to something much more serious. Commander Thorne reached our group with the kind of presence that made everyone automatically step back and fall silent. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that came from decades of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. His dress uniform was immaculate, decorated with ribbons and commendations that spoke to a career of distinguished service. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Excuse me," he said, his tone respectful but commanding absolute attention. The mocking laughter died instantly. Bradley Crenshaw's cruel smile faltered as he found himself face to face with this decorated military officer. "Miss, may I see your wrist?" The request was polite, but it wasn't really a request. Everyone in the circle understood that this man expected compliance, and the shift in power dynamics was immediate and dramatic. The phones that had been recording Freya's humiliation were now capturing something entirely different. Freya looked uncertain for the first time all evening. She glanced at me, then back at Commander Thorne, clearly trying to understand what was happening. After a moment of hesitation, she extended her left arm, rolling up her sleeve to reveal the small tattoo that had caused so much mockery. Commander Thorne's reaction was immediate and profound. His eyes widened as he studied the markings, and I watched his face transform from professional interest to something much deeper. Recognition, shock, and what looked like overwhelming emotion played across his features as he read whatever was inscribed there. "These are coordinates," he said, his voice suddenly thick with feeling. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. "Latitude and longitude, and this number here, this is a military service number." He looked up at Freya, and I could see tears beginning to form in his eyes. This battle-hardened military commander, this man who had undoubtedly seen and survived horrors I couldn't imagine, was fighting to maintain his composure. "This service number belongs to Staff Sergeant Miguel Rivera," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "He was under my command in Afghanistan." The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop as everyone processed what they were hearing. The same executives who had been making jokes about random scribbles and poor judgment now stood frozen, beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. Freya's eyes filled with tears as she spoke for the first time since Commander Thorne had approached. "Miguel Rivera was my fiancé," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the silent room. "He was killed by an IED 3 years ago." Commander Thorne closed his eyes for a moment as if gathering strength, then opened them and looked directly at my sister with an expression of profound respect and sorrow. "Staff Sergeant Rivera died saving the lives of 12 soldiers in his unit," he said, his military bearing returning as he spoke of the fallen. "These coordinates mark the exact location where he made his final stand. He threw himself between his men and an improvised explosive device. He died instantly, but his sacrifice saved every member of his squad." The transformation in the room was complete and devastating. Bradley Crenshaw had gone white as a sheet. Vivian Cross had lowered her phone, her face showing the horror of someone who realized they had just mocked a war widow. Robert Chen was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Commander Thorne then did something that will be burned into my memory forever. This decorated officer, this man who had commanded troops in combat zones, snapped to perfect military attention and rendered a crisp salute to my sister. "Ma'am." Staff Sergeant Rivera was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the honor to command. He spoke of you often in his letters home. It would be my privilege to shake the hand of the woman he loved." The entire ballroom watched in absolute silence as my sister, tears streaming down her face, shook hands with the man who had been Miguel's commanding officer. In that moment, the tattoo that had been a source of mockery was revealed for what it truly was. A memorial to genuine heroism and love that transcended anything these corporate executives had ever experienced. The silence that followed Commander Thorne's salute seemed to stretch forever. I watched as the weight of what had just happened settled over the entire ballroom. These successful, powerful people who had been so quick to mock and judge were now confronted with the reality of their cruelty. They had attacked a woman carrying one of the most profound losses imaginable, turning her memorial to a fallen hero into entertainment. Commander Thorne wasn't finished. He kept Freya's hand in his and began speaking to the entire gathering, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed sacrifice firsthand. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Rivera was 24 years old when he died," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. He had been in Afghanistan for 8 months, counting down the days until he could come home and marry this woman. The night before the mission that took his life, he wrote her a letter describing the ring he had picked out, the house they would buy, the children they would have. I could see people throughout the ballroom wiping their eyes. The transformation from mockery to mourning was complete and devastating. When the IED exploded, Miguel had a choice, Commander Thorne continued. He could have taken cover and saved himself. Instead, he threw his body between the blast and his squad. 12 men went home to their families because of his decision. 12 fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands are alive today because Staff Sergeant Rivera chose their lives over his own. Bradley Crenshaw stepped forward, his face pale and his voice shaking. "I owe you more than an apology could ever express," he said to Freya. "What we did tonight was unforgivable. I want you to know that Pacific Tech Solutions would be honored to work with your firm, and I personally guarantee we will treat you with the respect you deserved from the beginning." But it was Vivian Cross who surprised me most. This woman who had been so eager to record Freya's humiliation was now openly crying. "I posted something horrible on social media while this was happening," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm deleting it right now, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what really happened here tonight. What Miguel Rivera did, what you carry with you every day, people need to understand that kind of courage." The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people approaching Freya to offer their own apologies and condolences. But I noticed something remarkable happening. Instead of treating her like a victim to be pitied, they were speaking to her with genuine respect, asking about her work, her ideas, her vision for their companies. The tattoo that had been used to diminish her had become a symbol of the strength they finally recognized. As we drove home later that night, Freya was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. "I never told you the whole story about Miguel," she said, staring out at the Seattle skyline. "I got this tattoo not just to remember him, but to remind myself every day that I carry the strength of everyone who ever believed in me. Miguel, our parents, you. When people see this tattoo and judge me for it, they're really judging their own capacity for understanding." She rolled up her sleeve and looked at the coordinates and service number that had caused so much pain and revelation in one evening. Miguel wrote in that last letter that he hoped I would never be afraid to show the world who I really am. He said the people worth knowing would understand, and the people who didn't understand weren't worth knowing anyway. Tonight proved he was right. 3 months later, Freya not only received her promotion to senior director, but she was also invited to speak at a military appreciation dinner where she met Miguel's parents for the first time. They told her that Miguel had written about her in every letter, describing her as the strongest person he had ever known. The tattoo on her wrist became a bridge instead of a barrier, connecting her to a community of military families who understood loss and strength in ways that corporate executives never could. She learned that true strength isn't about hiding your scars, but about wearing them with dignity and using them to recognize the battles others have fought. Sometimes the things that make us different, the marks we carry, aren't weaknesses to be concealed. They're stories waiting to be understood by people with the wisdom to look beyond surface judgments and see the courage underneath.